to, we're going to proceed with this no matter what. I think we've got our whole audience in one place now. Thanks so much for your patience. It seems these Zoom conferences, I hope most people understand that half the time we don't know what they're doing, and the other half, funny things are happening on Zoom. But I'm really happy to welcome Julia Gray, who is going to talk to us about her 2018 article in the issue of Chebacco titled John Snow's Postcard Basket, a story of Wabanaki presence and persistence on Mount Desert Island. Julia is an independent museum consultant based in Orland. She worked for more than 17 years at the Abbe Museum in Bar Harbor, starting as collections assistant and making her way to director of collections and research. She is a graduate of Bowdoin College and the University of Arkansas with degrees in anthropology. Her museum work has focused on collections and exhibits, and prior to joining the team at the Abbe, she worked in cultural resource management archaeology across the state of Maine. She is also the volunteer assistant fire chief for the town of Orland. And I should mention that she is the secretary of the Mount Desert Island Historical Society Board of Directors. Julia, welcome.
Thank you, Tim. So I did want to start out today by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Orland, which is in the traditional homeland of the Penobscot Nation, just a few miles from the banks of the river that takes its name from their nation. So thanks, Tim.
You with us, Julia?
I am at the moment. Yes, I think I froze for a minute there.
I think you did. Why don't you tell us, you wanted to say that we're here on Wabanaki land. Can you, oh, yeah, I think maybe we've just lost you.
No, oh, no, I just shut off my video. Can you hear me? No.
Oh, yes, I can hear you. Great.
You can hear me. Okay.
Let's press on. We're going to do this.
Okay. We'll keep my video off. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Orland, which is in the traditional homeland of the Penobscot Nation, just a few couple of miles from the banks of the river that takes its name from the Penobscot Nation.
And Julia, just to confirm, we're looking at the first slide that we want everybody to be looking at.
We're looking at the cover of, the cover of Chebacco. Yep.
Very good. Well, let us begin by asking you to read us a section from your article.
Sure. Speaking to the present, to me, the most significant and valuable pieces we can share from our museum collections are those that can speak to the present and can help us see how we can work to make the world around us a more compassionate and equitable place. I believe that this basket embodies the stories that can work towards that goal. The adaptation and persistence that led to the creation of this fairly unassuming basket can help people today to understand and appreciate how it is that the Wabanaki people, building from a solid foundation of thousands of years of tradition and culture, continued to make their way in a changing world. The impact of colonization on the Wabanaki people was incredibly destructive. Between warfare, disease, bounty hunters, and usurpation of their land, and the destruction of the resources they relied on, the survival of their people and their culture is something we can all learn from. John Snow and what we know about his life and his family can provide valuable insight into the ways that people from different cultures and from different worldviews can interact and coexist. Of course, it also speaks to the stereotypes and implicit and sometimes explicit bias and racism that have been part of Euro-American relationships with Wabanaki since first contact.
So thank you. And I have the impression, Julia, that this is a topic that is very important to you. You've built a great part of your life around creating a greater understanding of the Wabanaki people and trying to understand it yourself. Can you tell us how you look at a basket, how an object such as this?
Sure, and hopefully, are you still hearing me okay?
I can hear you just fine, yes.
So one of the really wonderful things about this particular issue of Chebacco is that contributors were asked to think about and contribute a piece about an object or a place that had meaning to them as part of the work that they did. And so what I share about this basket has meaning to me, making sure that people recognize that I'm not Wabanaki, I'm not Passamaquoddy. And so the way I connect with it is very specific to my background and my experiences. And that everyone should take an opportunity to also connect with Wabanaki people and culture through Wabanaki voices. And we'll talk about some ways to do that a little bit later on. As an anthropologist and a museum person, I see material culture objects as one of the many ways we have of knowing about culture and history. An object can embody cultural knowledge, history, experiences in a way that's different from, say, for example, photographs or words written down on a page. And especially as coming at it from museum perspective and different ways of knowing, we want to look at all of the different sources of information. So the object in the context with stories, oral traditions, written records, language, contemporary knowledge, all come together to give us an opportunity to learn in a different way than we might from some other historical resource.
And you, along with other authors, everybody in this issue of Chebacco went into a deep dive to try to understand the object. Began with John Snow's postcard basket. How did you decide that this is the story that you need to tell?
Well, I wanted to bring out a story that was really significant to Mount Desert Island. Certainly a lot of the Abbe's collections speak to Wabanaki stories across the Wabanaki homeland, but this has a really special story about Mount Desert Island. A lot of times when people are talking about or think about Wabanaki people on Mount Desert Island, they think of archaeological sites, they think of the stories of Champlain and Demont interacting with Wabanaki people, or they may think about the Wabanaki encampments of the late 19th or early 20th century. But I think they don't often think about what's happened since then. So the fact that the Wabanaki people had been here for thousands of years and are still here and still present and working in various ways on Mount Desert Island, John Snow provides kind of a bridge between the history that some people know and a history that I expect most people don't know of continuity and continuing presence on Mount Desert Island for Wabanaki people.
And tell us, who was John Snow?
So I may sound a little bit like I'm reading on, make sure I get dates right. So John Snow was Passamaquoddy. He was born in 1868 at Chebacco, which many folks may know as Pleasant Point, down East Maine. And he lived most of his adult life and raised a family here on Mount Desert Island, primarily Northeast Harbor. He was a craftsman, a businessman, and a storyteller. He made birch bark containers and model canoes, and then he also made sealskin souvenirs, and he sold baskets and other items made by other Wabanaki folks, both from a location in Northeast Harbor, and he'd also go door to door. He also shared stories with local folks, traditional stories with local folks and researchers. And his 4 children, from his second wife, Alice Saca Basin, grew up in Northeast Harbor and attended elementary school in the first part of the 20th century. John died in 1937 and is buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Northeast Harbor.
Okay, and you say that the little basket featured here embodies John Snow's story and the network he was part of. Can you tell us how you went from this object and decided that it embodies John Snow's story?
Sure. So it's not a very big piece, but the pieces that go into it really speak to the connections that exist in a lot of different ways. And I think it's fascinating to look at an object and recognize how it can represent all of these different connections in the life of the creator and the collector and the museum that it ends up in. So at the time that John Snow was living and making things and selling items on Mount Desert Island, making a basket was a communal activity. It wasn't an individual artist's work all by themselves. So for example, the ash splints that are the structure of the basket were either harvested at Mataquacook, which is the Passamaquoddy Reservation at Indian Township, or perhaps purchased from Micmac or Maliseet ash harvester from Aroostook County, which many basket makers still do. We have stories of John Snow traveling to the Cranberry Isles to harvest sweetgrass. So there's every chance that the sweetgrass in the basket was something that he harvested. And you see his connections to the land through that he knew of the places to gather sweetgrass, and that's special cultural knowledge. Most likely the basket was not made by John Snow. It was probably made by one of the women in his family, either his immediate or extended family. And this was pretty common, certainly during the 19th and early 20th century, that women or groups of women would participate kind of communally in making baskets, and that they would get their ash and their sweetgrass from somebody else, and then they would braid the sweetgrass and weave the basket. And our guess is that John Snow was selling the basket made by one of the women in his family. There's also the connection, the network that it shows to John Snow as someone who was making a life for himself in a non-Wabanaki economy. That he had this photograph of himself that was enclosed in the basket that he was selling. And the photograph depicts him as a traditional Passamaquoddy man, but it also gives the authenticity to the piece so that he can successfully market it in the economy he was dealing with at the time. That people wanted, if they're going to buy an Indian basket, they wanted to know it was an Indian basket, and that photograph made that very clear. So he was able to market himself and his identity. And then the story with the basket also connects into the local network on Mount Desert Island. The basket belonged to Mrs. Elizabeth Black of Northeast Harbor, and she gave it to her grandson, Robert Earls, about 65 years ago. And then as he was looking for new homes for pieces from his collection, he gave the basket to the Abbe Museum in 2000. So one of the things I think that museums are starting to recognize is that there's a story about the object, and there's also the story of how especially Native American and indigenous objects come to be in museums. And that network within Northeast Harbor was how this basket came to be at the Abbe Museum in 2000.
So tell us again, what was the date of manufacture? Do you have an estimate of that?
We don't for this, but probably in the 20s or early 30s. So let's see, so 2000 minus 65, and then it was before that. So I would say probably in the 19 teens or 20s. There's another piece.
So nearly a century ago.
Yeah, and you'll see there's another piece that you'll see an image of a little bit later that is dated to 1905 that we think is a John Snow piece. So we know he was making and selling pieces in 1905. Yeah.
So how did John Snow, tell us more about that connection that John Snow made between non-native people to the cultural heritage of the Passamaquoddy?
Sure.
And I'm thinking maybe that there are some viewers who maybe need a basic primer on how Passamaquoddy and Wabanaki are related. Can you just take us through that?
Good point, Tim. Yeah, so Wabanaki is a term that is an overarching term that refers to a confederacy of Native American nations from what's now New England and Eastern Canada. The term Wabanaki is derived from a Passamaquoddy and/or Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, Maliseet words that mean interpreted variously as people of the first light, people where the sun first rises, and that as among indigenous nations in what's now North America, the Wabanaki nations were the first to see the sun hit the continent. Within Wabanaki is included, and obviously that's something that matters on MDI, because MDI is very proud of the fact that at least some months of the year it gets the sun first.
Right.
And then under the Wabanaki Confederacy are the Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy Nation, the Micmac and Maliseet tribes, and the Abenaki. And Passamaquoddy, who John Snow was a member of the Passamaquoddy Nation, are primarily today located in easternmost Maine, in parts of Washington County and in parts of New Brunswick.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
And we see canoes on the shore of Bar Harbor, which seems to be another way, one of perhaps many ways that the Passamaquoddy people and other Wabanaki connected non-native people to their cultural heritage. Can you touch on what were the contents of this photograph?
Sure. So what we're seeing is an image from the time period of the Wabanaki encampments, the large Wabanaki encampments in Bar Harbor, and there were smaller ones on other parts of the island. This was a summer tradition that actually reflected long-term subsistence practices of spending time on the coast in the summertime to harvest coastal resources. And for thousands of years, the Wabanaki were coming to Mount Desert Island to do that, to gather together with more extended networks in their birch bark canoes. And their birch bark canoes were designed both for work using on rivers and lakes and streams, but also for ocean going. So a lot of Wabanaki guides would set up shop in Bar Harbor and other parts of the island during these late 19th, early 20th century encampments, and they would take, they'd take young people out for canoeing adventures. They would take sports out for bird hunting, that sort of thing. And they would also, when they weren't picking out people as guides, they would be harvesting, fish and porpoise and so on, that they would sustain them while they were in Bar Harbor for the summertime.
Right. Okay.
And that story of this is kind of the peak of the interaction between the rusticators and Wabanaki on Mount Desert Island. And that's a better known story than certainly a lot of the Wabanaki history in the area. And by about 1920, a little bit earlier, these encampments had really started to kind of had waned, and for a variety of reasons, both intentional and unintentional. And so the visible presence of Wabanaki people on Mount Desert Island was a lot less. It became easier to not know about Wabanaki presence in this place. But John Snow stayed, and he would have been here during the late encampment period, but then he stayed and he made a life, and he continued to sell and make Passamaquoddy art and crafts. And most likely for a lot of people, especially the people that were young people at that time, he was their only exposure to Passamaquoddy history and culture and people during that time period of the late 20s and the early 1930s. I think several times when I've talked with people about this piece, they will say, oh yes, my family has a John Snow piece in our house. So those people still have those connections, and they remember him because of that object that became part of their family tradition.
So perhaps an object like this is one of those things that you encounter.
Yeah, and this piece, I talked briefly earlier about one of the things he was a storyteller, and he worked with several anthropologists, early 20th century anthropologists, to share Passamaquoddy oral traditions and stories, both in Passamaquoddy and in English. He would tell them in Passamaquoddy, and they would get written down. He would translate them. And one of the anthropologists or recreational anthropologists that he worked with was Mary Cabot Wheelwright and her friend Fanny Hardy Ekstrom, who's a pretty well-known folklorist from Maine from the early 20th century. And this particular piece, which is the one that has the date 1905 on it, was part of Mary Cabot Wheelwright's collection that came to the Abbe Museum in the early 1930s.
What is depicted on this letterbox?
Somebody that's better at bird. It's a bird. I wish I should.
Sorry.
If it was chickadee, I know what it was. So certainly, it's a good example of etched birch bark from that time period by Wabanaki artists. It has nature motifs. It has a bird. It has the leaves. The leaf pattern on this is especially distinctive of John Snow's work. This piece isn't signed, and it's not documented as being his. But we have several pieces that are signed, and we know he made, that have his wonderful, delicate leaf pattern on them that really indicate that this being his work. Yeah. And it's really handy to have an object with the date right on it, because then we know exactly when it was made.
Yeah, we should emphasize to our listeners to, if you deal with family photographs and other objects, please put the year on it. Your descendants will appreciate it. And so tell us about this photograph and how John Snow's legacy speaks to the present. But before you do, let me invite our listeners to post questions. Unfortunately, due to our slow internet connection, I won't be able to see posts to Facebook Live, your comments on Facebook Live. We've just tried to shut down every interfering stream. But if you can post your questions on the Q&A of Zoom, if you're watching that way, please put them there. And Facebook folks, go ahead and put your comments in and comment section. I'm sorry, Julia, please tell us how John Snow's legacy speaks to the present.
Sure. So certainly one of the things that's really key to the work at the Abbe Museum, and that I think matters a lot to the work that we do, is to make sure that everyone we encounter and engage with knows that Wabanaki people are still here today. And they've been here for thousands of years, and that persistence and that adaptation has continued. And John Snow, again, his time here on Mount Desert Island is a really important bridge between that better known rusticated era and the era of the encampments, which are pretty well documented, and contemporary Wabanaki presence here on Mount Desert Island. And thinking about the fact that John Snow, at least in part, was making his living by creating and selling art and craft, and that was the financial resources of Mount Desert Island were a really important survival tool for Wabanaki people for a century or more, and that continues here today on Mount Desert Island. The presence of Wabanaki people continues. It's also important to recognize that there are recollections of John Snow that share stories of people not being particularly nice to him, of people being afraid of him, and reflecting on kind of the stereotypes that existed of Native people at the time in the early 20th century. And that presence of racism and conscious and unconscious bias is something that's continues to be a part of interactions with Wabanaki people. Even here on MDI, and certainly it's an ongoing challenge at the Abbe Museum to encounter especially conscious and unconscious bias against Indigenous people. And so thinking about what this can tell us for today, and the fact that there's some really, really strong anti-racism work in the local communities on Mount Desert Island to make sure that work engages with the Indigenous people whose homeland we're so privileged to call home.
Yeah.
And the picture you're seeing,
Sure,
the picture you're seeing is Gabriel Frey, who's a Passamaquoddy basket maker, like John Snow, or artist like John Snow was, and he's an Abbe Museum trustee, and he's also has a strong presence at both the Native American Festival and the Abbe Museum Indian Market, which are important ways that tradition of being able to sell your artwork to make a living continues on Mount Desert Island into the present.
and we've been looking at John Snow's century-old basket, and here is Gabriel Frey creating a new basket. Do you notice significant differences between the nature of these crafts and today?
Oh, there's a lot of tradition that carries on, and a lot of creativity that each generation of basket makers has brought into, and artists has brought into their work. You'll see they're still using the same materials. They're still using brown or black ash. They're still using sweetgrass. They're using methods that were taught by grandparents and parents and great grandparents. And each generation has introduced its own creativity, both as an art, certainly now very much as artists. You'll see the work that basket makers and other artists are doing, but also to meet a changing market. If you're going to succeed as an artist, people have to buy your work, and so that's certainly part of that adaptation. But it's neat to see work, and just the example that we see in the photograph and the image that's on the screen. Gabe is making a purse essentially, but he's using the form and the methods that would be used to make pack baskets for generations. He uses all natural dyes for his baskets, so he's using all plant-based or other natural dyes for his baskets. But there's obviously differences. They're obviously, they're made for modern living. They are the elaborateness. They're stunningly elaborate. But he's still using the same materials, and he's still harvesting them in the same way that they were in 1905.
Well, you've touched on so many important areas.
Sorry, you're coming in and out on me, Tim.
Well, I asked where should people go for more, to learn more about this process, about the Wabanaki, about basket making and so forth.
Sure. So certainly I do want to put in a plug. So even though we're not doing it in person, the MDI Historical Society's annual meeting is going to be online via Zoom next Tuesday, August 4th at 4:30. And the featured speaker is Chris Newell, who is the relatively new as of March, executive director and senior partner to Wabanaki Nations at the Abbe Museum. He's Passamaquoddy, an educator, and he'll be speaking about the importance of education about Indigenous people in the Wabanaki. So that's a great opportunity, again, to hear directly from a Passamaquoddy person instead of from me, a non-native person. Also, the Abbe Museum has great online resources that I would encourage folks to visit. And we talked about how John Snow made his living by selling art and craft, and that's still so important in the Wabanaki communities. And this current pandemic has been a huge challenge for these artists, Native artists, because they sell their work at shows. That's the primarily where they sell it, is at things like the Abbe Museum Indian Market and the Native American Festival, neither of which were able to happen in person. So the Abbe Museum did online versions of, virtual versions of both. And on their website, they have connections to the artists so that those of you who have the capacity or interest can connect with artists and buy their work and keep Wabanaki art going.
Very good. And let's see if there are any questions or comments from the audience. I'm grateful to everybody who hung with us while we suffered through some of our technical problems. Let's try turning on our videos one more time. Julia, and see if we can at least see each other, even if, let us know. Well, I don't see any right now.
Let's see if I can see anything.
Maybe the whole world is having connection difficulties. Julia, thank you so much for being part of this discussion. We will we'll take a look at how the quality of this recording turned out, and if it's unwatchable, we'll come back and try something new with a more solid connection. I think maybe the thunderstorms moving through have something to do with it, but who knows?
Yep.
To our audience, thanks so much for tuning in. Join us next week. We're going to be talking to Carl. Oh gosh, I'm flustered what to do next. Have another past issue of Chebacco to bring to you. Thanks everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.